Linda. As Linda mentioned, if you guys have questions, go ahead and enter those into the chat feature of Zoom. I do expect a lively discussion. I think we have, 30 minutes for discussion when we're all done?
Correct.
So we'll try to hit on all of the questions and topics. It's potentially a controversial topic today, which makes it fun and entertaining. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll jump right into the presentation. Let's see. So you guys can see my screen?
That's correct.
Linda is shaking her head vigorously, so I'm going to go ahead. The topic today is systemic insecticides. And the title here, Understanding Systemic Insecticides and Their Potential Impacts in Urban Ecosystems. It's a pretty broad topic, and we're just going to scratch the surface, but I hope to give you some general knowledge that you can apply when thinking about these pest management tactics in the environment, especially urban ecosystems. For those of you who don't know me, I am the San Francisco Bay Area Urban IPM Advisor. I have a varied background. I've kind of shifted in my career from horticulture, then to commercial agriculture, and now I'm working in what we call urban systems, which really don't involve plants, unless they're dead and kiln dried and constructed into a structure. So I've worked in lots of different pest management systems, but it's always been about IPM. And IPM, of course, is integrated pest management. There's a whole process of IPM. It doesn't mean that we're focused on certain tactics. It means that we're using this decision-making process, and that's a lecture for another day. So in my position, which is fairly new, I do work with pest management professionals. I also work with cities, counties, and definitely master gardeners. And I know many of you hail as master gardeners. This is a regional program. I work directly in 5 counties. Alameda is the home county, Contra Costa, San Mateo, San Francisco, and Santa Clara, but I'm also part of this statewide program, UC IPM, and I'll show you some of those resources available from UC IPM later. The goals of my program are to reduce unnecessary pesticide applications, and the impact of that outcome will be improved environmental quality, especially surface water quality. And I'm also looking to kind of tinker with the pest control industry by hopefully increasing demand for and provision of IPM services. So the critters I'm showing here are the subjects of some of my ongoing research, bed bugs and subterranean termites. But remember, I have a broad background in horticulture and agriculture, and I actually have done some research with systemic insecticides. So maybe I'm not the most expert of the experts on this topic, but I have some knowledge to share with you guys. What are we going to talk about here? First, I'll introduce some terminology. What are systemic pesticides? What are systemic insecticides? Why are we concerned? What's the problem? There's a lot of non-target effects and unintended consequences associated with these products. And then if we have time, we'll look at some alternatives for the pests that are commonly targeted in urban home and garden environments by systemic insecticides. So first off, you probably have heard this term, systemic. What does it mean? If you look it up, it's used in lots of other systems outside of horticulture. It generally means it relates to the system as opposed to a particular part. So we're talking about a whole system. It's also used in medicine or physiology, and it means, very similar. We're talking about a system rather than a part or an organ-specific function. In horticulture, It means that the material enters a plant, usually via the roots, sometimes the shoots, and then is able to pass throughout all the tissues. So for a pesticide to do this, it's pretty amazing. It means that all live tissues of the plant that incorporate water are going to have this active ingredient there to poison a pest or potentially impact a non-target organism. So we do have other systemic pesticides, herbicides. So one that's in the news, past couple of years, glyphosate or Roundup. So that's an herbicide that you can spray on a leaf. And if you get pretty good coverage, if the dose is right, you can kill the entire plant. And it's because it gets translocated throughout the plant. A lot of our fungicides work the same way. They get injected at certain parts of a tree. They may be expressed all throughout that tree. And then we also have bioinsecticides that work systemically. Some of them are transgenic. We learned hopefully about BT crops, where we have a bacterium where we have toxic metabolites from a bacterium in corn, soybeans, other crops, and those transgenes are all over the plant, so the toxin is all over the plant. And even some of our insect growth regulators, which are considered reduced risk, move throughout the plant and are considered systemic. I'm going to concentrate on these conventional systemic insecticides during this talk. It used to be that we commonly used in both urban and agricultural environments carbamates and organophosphates. Now, these are nervous system toxins that actually have effects on vertebrate animals, including humans. And so they've been phased out of all non-agricultural applications, and they're in the process of being phased out of agricultural applications here in the United States. But what the industry did is keep developing active ingredients. And in the 1990s, we got this class of insecticides called neonicotinoids. It's still around, and these insecticides are the most widely used in the world. I'll show some graphs to kind of show how that use has increased here in a little bit. And then there's a material called fipronil, which has a different mode of action, but it still gets readily translocated within plants, and it has the same ecological issues that these others do. It's not available for residential use. You have to be a professional to use it, but except if it's on your pet. And I'll talk about that in a second here, but most of the fipronil use in California, at least, is in the structural pest control industry, termites and ants. So how does it work? I think you guys can see my cursor here, but if you apply something to the soil and it's water soluble, all these systemic insecticides are water soluble, they get taken up in water and then translocated via the xylem to all the tissues of the plant that incorporate water. Now, some of these systemic insecticides get applied to the foliage, and they actually can move through the phloem into the xylem and then back to every part of the plant. And so this little diagram on the right shows that depending on water pressure, you do have movement of water and, of course, dissolved compounds from phloem back into the xylem. And then, of course, it can go anywhere in the plant. So these are two different ways that these systemic insecticides are applied. The neonicotinoids are by far the more common and more popular of these systemics. We've had them since the 90s, and they're considered reduced risk for humans and vertebrates because they bind more strongly to insect nervous receptors than to vertebrate nervous receptors, and that is a departure from previous active ingredients. So they were considered safer when they came onto the market. Also, there were some marketing claims that these materials were safer for other insects, because the logic was that if you're not eating the plant, you won't be poisoned. So the poison is contained within the plant. And so we're going to talk about why that may not be, or is probably not the case. So again, these have a systemic action. They usually are applied to the roots. They may be applied to above ground plant parts of the plant. They also can be applied through the bark. So we have neonicotinoids that are applied as bark bands, and they're very water soluble. They move in through the bark, and then they can shoot up in the xylem after passing through the phloem. Seed treatments in agriculture, certain crops are actually coated with neonicotinoids so that when they germinate, the germinating seed picks up that material in its root, and from day one, basically the plant is quote unquote protected from pests. Now the problem is we now know that these materials go to all parts of the plant, including nectar, pollen, and what we call guttation fluid or other exudates that come out of the leaves. So, and again, there's so many different ways that these things are applied. In trees, they might be injected or banded on trunks. In the garden, they're often sprayed or drenched. And then, of course, we do have these seed coatings. In urban pest control, they're usually formulated as baits, and they're not applied to plants at all. So again, these are the most widely used insecticides in the world. And they have a broad spectrum activity, which means they kill all insects. There are probably 5 or 6 common active ingredients, but there are only 4 that you're going to find in home and garden products. Now this is being recorded, so hopefully you guys can go back and look at these later. I'm not going to go over each one. I will say that most of the Bayer Advanced, if not all of the Bayer Advanced products, do contain one of these neonicotinoids. Some of the green light products and some of the ortho products can also contain them. Now, we use these insecticides on our pets as well. The 2 most common flea treatments in the United States and perhaps globally are systemics. Frontline is fipronil, and Advantage is imidacloprid. And there's research that shows that just washing your pet leads to surface water contamination. Let's say you're washing your pet in the bathtub. That water goes to a treatment facility, and it eventually gets discharged into a river or other surface water system, and around here that goes to the bay. So it's becoming apparent that our pets are playing a role in the environmental contamination we see due to these insecticides. I'd love to talk more about that. It's a very controversial topic, it's just emerging. So in agriculture, we see this really steady increase, perhaps a geometric increase of, this is measured in million kilograms globally. And so imidacloprid was the first one. Now we have other active ingredients, especially clothianidin and thiamethoxam, which are used on seed treatments, becoming popular. This was taken out of a 2015 review article. It shows different places in the world where this trend is similar. Sales in Sweden, that's this line down here. Domestic shipment in Japan, that's this line on top here. Reported use in California, that's the dotted black line, and agricultural use in Britain. So you can see that these active ingredients are still continuing to increase in use. We find them in our food. I'm not going to dwell on this table, but fruiting vegetables seem to be the place where we find neonicotinoids most often. In this study, this was a European study, but it's almost half of the samples of things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant. So there's a number of active ingredients of neonicotinoids. They vary according to how they get taken up by plants and how long they persist in the environment. And this is important to understand how they're formulated and how they're used. So here's some generalizations. Again, the common ones in home and garden use are imidacloprid, acetamiprid, and thimethoxam, dinotefuran. So dinotefuran is used mostly on trees. Fast uptake, this is the one that is used in bark banding. Acetamiprid is the only one that's really registered for foliar applications, and then imidacloprid is the one that's in most of those Bayer advanced products. They're quite persistent in the environment. So if they get exposed to ultraviolet light, they go through this degradation process called photolysis, and then you're talking about it only a couple days, the materials are breaking down. But if they're not exposed to the light, you're talking about a half-life of about 40 days for imidacloprid. And then you put them into the soil, and they last a very long time. So here we have the soil half-life of imidacloprid, thimethoxam, and clothianidin. So we're talking in some cases thousands of days, so multiple years if they're in soil and they're protected from ultraviolet light. We know there's not much bacterial or microbial degradation of these compounds. So they do stick around in the soil. And I think in clay soils, which we have around here, they stick around longer than in sandy soils. They differ in water solubility. Remember, dinotefuran is the one that's applied to trees as a bark band, and this is the most water soluble. That's what allows it to go through the bark. It actually penetrates the bark and gets into the phloem, passes through the phloem, gets into the xylem, goes up everywhere in the plant. They are not usually stable in ultraviolet light, except for acetamiprid. And this is the one that is labeled for foliar use. So you can see if you're going to apply it to the leaves of a plant, you want it to last longer in the sun. And indeed, that's reflected in the labels of these products. So what's the problem? Now, you guys probably know a lot of this suite of problems, so I'm preaching to the choir, but we have non-target effects. These things kill all insects. So it kills the pests, but we also kill natural enemies. And this may be to direct mortality. So if you spray a plant that has ladybird beetles, you're going to kill them. It could be due to drenches. So if you have soil inhabiting insects, they're going to be killed by a drench. But also due to feeding on plant components, nectar, pollen, exudates. So there we have the issue where some of our natural enemies, like this hoverfly in the second photo, they actually feed on pollen and nectar. So they're getting a toxic dose whenever they do that if the plant has been treated. And then there's this really interesting indirect mortality. So if you're a predatory bug like this pirate bug here, and you're eating a relatively sessile prey, which means it doesn't move around, let's say it's an aphid, doesn't move around that much, the aphid may have already been intoxicated with this material, and it's just sitting there on the plant. So the pirate bug comes along, drinks up all the fluids within that aphid, and it gets a mortal dose, and it dies due to systemic insecticide application. There's lots of literature out there that shows how this affects things like parasitoid wasps. We know that parasitoids feed on nectar. They sometimes do something called host feeding, where they will stab at an aphid or a whitefly nymph and then drink the fluid that comes out. And so they can get directly and indirectly poisoned in that way. And then, of course, pollinators. So we've got a number of bees, honeybees, native bees, wasps, flies, you name it, beetles, anything that's going to pollen and nectar could be directly killed by these applications if the quantities and concentrations are right. So you've got direct mortality due to contact with the plant. If there's a residue, if there was a foliar application, you've got direct mortality due to nectar, pollen, and exudate feeding. And then we have a complex topic where you have sublethal effects. So in honeybees, it's been suggested that low doses of neonicotinoids interfere with their ability to find the hive again, and so those bees die if they can't find the hive. So there's perhaps some effect on memory or learning. That doesn't kill the bees outright, but if they can't find their hive or their nest, they will die. There's lots of literature out there. It's funny, this used to be a controversial topic and people would shout you down and argue with you. But now the body of literature is so large, it's becoming a consensus agreed upon phenomenon. Soil applied neonicotinoids do move into the nectar and pollen of plants. And you can imagine that creates all kinds of problems for pollinators. This article on the bottom shows that just using insecticides in a lawn moved this material into the flowers in the lawn. So think like dandelions and English daisies or clover, and the bees were killed because of those flowers just growing in the lawns. And then guttation fluid, is becoming studied. Whenever water potential is right, there's a lot of plants that really do exude water, and insects drink that. It's a great source of water, especially in a place like California where there's no rain for 6 months of the year. That stuff's toxic if the plant has been treated. What about other beneficial invertebrates? There's some studies that there are detrimental effects to earthworms, other detritivores in the leaf litter. Aquatic invertebrates are very sensitive to these systemic insecticides. So we're talking about the little crustaceans that form the base of the food web in creeks, rivers, and streams, and the bay, of course. And then what about mycophagous insects? These are insects that feed on fungi that are growing on the plants. That's related to some of my research. So first I'll show you that there's a growing body of literature on detriment to earthworms. It's quite controversial, and there's only one group that's been able to replicate these observations, but there's something there. And then this is work that I just published. It dates back to my time at UC Davis when I was working on agricultural systems. I was working with a coccinellid beetle, so that's like a ladybird beetle that eats powdery mildew. And we were able to show that applying imidacloprid to the soil of a plant with powdery mildew resulted in imidacloprid up in the powdery mildew on the leaf. And when these larvae, this is a beetle larva, when it ate the powdery mildew, it resulted in a toxic effect. So this is kind of a trophic movement from plant to fungus to beetle, and you have a lethal effect. There are other unintended consequences. We have biological control systems that rely on predators keeping pests in check. And those natural enemies are often more sensitive. So you may apply a neonicotinoid and have an outbreak of a secondary pest. So here's an example of red scale in citrus. So there are some citrus orchards that were treated with imidacloprid and others that were not. And they were treated for, I think it was aphids or some other pest, maybe psyllids. But what you see is a spike in the number of red scales. And this is because the natural enemies, which are little parasitoid wasps, are being killed by these applications. So it's an unintended consequence. And then we have unexplained increases in fitness of some spider mites. So this is some really intriguing research on the East Coast. It's been going on for 10 or 15 years. I met the researchers at entomology conferences and I've talked to them, but they basically see spikes in spider mite populations when imidacloprid is used in landscape trees. And so it's usually used for aphids or adelgids or psyllids, but you have a spike in the spider mite population. And it's unexplained. Recently, they've looked at the feeding of two spider mite predators. This is a coccinellid beetle and a lacewing larva, and they are the feeding is reduced when imidacloprid is present. So that could have something to do with this spike in spider mites that they see, but it's also something else. They think that there's some kind of fitness boost that spider mites receive for some other reason. It could have to do with plant vigor. Plants sometimes increase in vigor when they get treated with these kinds of materials. The same phenomenon has been seen on ornamental plants. So this is boxwood. You know, mites just really spike after an imidacloprid application. We continue. What's the problem? Hopefully you know by now, but we also contaminate surface water with these applications, and our invertebrates in the streams and creeks are very, very sensitive to these materials. We're starting to find them in California surface waters at way above the benchmark exceedances set by the state. As a result of all this, we do have increasing scrutiny and some new regulations in place. I guess they're not brand new. Most of them took place 2015 and 16 when we had some bee kills or bee die-offs. And so the European Union does not allow seed treatments using neonicotinoids anymore. The state of Oregon has a moratorium on one of the active ingredients. I think it is thiamethoxam that was associated with a bee kill. And the EPA now has this it's like a bee box that's on all neonicotinoids, and it is supposed to alert the user to the problem with pollinators. In nurseries, there was a program that started in 2015. I'm not sure if it's still happening. This is Home Depot. They have this little tag that you may find in your nursery plants. It says, this plant is protected from problematic aphids, whiteflies, beetles, and mealybugs, and other unwanted pests by neonicotinoids. And they remind you, hey, these are approved by the EPA. The thing is, they've actually been found in plants that are marketed for pollinators. You know, people that are planting pollinator gardens or trying to attract butterflies, they may be unwittingly poisoning bees in their gardens. This is a study that was published in 2016 called Gardeners Beware. It's easy to find online. A lot of the data comes from California. They did see the detection rate decrease during their study period, and they thought it had to do with retailers becoming aware of the problem and committing to suppliers that did not use neonicotinoids in production. But I think you still may find treated plants. They may or may not have the tag, so gardeners beware. Now, this is just a graphic showing all the different ways that these materials can get into the environment. Since they move in such unique ways, there are lots of different pathways that you may not consider. If you treat the soil and there's weeds growing, we'll call those non-target plants, the weeds take up the plant, all right? You have accumulation in the soil, especially at depth. You have crop residues. So if you have a cover crop and you plow that under, that's a crop residue that may have this material. And then you have wind and rain and runoff and all the other ways that pesticides contaminate the environment. So potentially scary stuff. Now, here's the question. Are there situations where systemic insecticides are required in home and garden situations? I don't know. I think it's debatable. All I know is that there are some pest systems that we commonly target. And I say we, I'm talking about the larger community, maybe not you and I, but pests that are commonly targeted by systemics include usually sapsuckers like aphids and soft scale insects, but increasingly citrus leaf miner, borers in trees, these are beetles, psyllids, including the Asian citrus psyllid, and white grubs and turf. So time permitting, I think, how am I doing on time? I guess I'm okay. Let's see. Yeah, I'm doing all right. Time permitting, I'm going to go through each of these common pest systems and talk about alternatives. So if you have a pest system like this and you're tempted to use a systemic insecticide because they work very well and they're very easy to use, what else could you do instead if you don't want to contribute to these ecological problems we just reviewed? First, aphids. We have a lot of information at UCIPM on how to manage aphids. I would say, really look at your management of the plant. Make sure that your plants are receiving proper irrigation so they're able to grow out of an aphid infestation. Avoid excess nitrogen fertilization. The reason is because when you have new shoots, that's where the aphids are really going to bloom. Some of you have pressure nozzles on your hoses, and it's a lot of fun to knock the aphids off. They're almost always going to die before they can get back up to the plant, whether they've been killed by the spray, they get picked off by a predator on the ground, or they just run out of energy. It's a non-chemical way to remove aphids from plants, like this shoot of some kind of a garden plant. We can conserve natural enemies. One way to do that is to avoid broad spectrum insecticides like neonicotinoids. Exclude ants. We have a huge Argentine ant problem in the Bay Area. If you can keep ants out of a plant like this, you're going to allow the natural enemies to take care of those pests. And so it may mean applying tanglefoot or a sticky band around the trunk of the plant. It may mean pruning it away from other plants so ants can't cross over. It may actually mean baiting the ants using some kind of a pesticidal bait. And then if all those things fail, aphids can be easily killed with direct contact insecticides like soaps, oils, and pyrethrins. Soft scale. Now these things can be really bad and they get knocked out easily by systemic insecticides. So it's tempting. But again, just like with aphids, you can keep the plants happy. They're less likely to be affected. You can prune out heavily infested branches. And these are usually a problem on woody plants. So when it comes time to prune, you can selectively prune those branches that are harboring scale insects. Conserve natural enemies, just like with the aphids. That means exclude ants. Scale insects are very well controlled by parasitoids, but you got to keep the ants out of the plant in order for them to do their work. If you are going to make a spray of some kind, you really have to monitor for the crawlers. This is the first instar scale insect that actually crawls from one place to the other and settles down in order to feed. That's the most susceptible to these contact insecticides, the soaps, oils, and pyrethrins. Those materials don't usually kill the scale insects once they're under their shell. Oils can work, but then of course oils can be phytotoxic at the wrong time of the year. Citrus leaf miner. This is becoming a major issue. It's very common in the Bay Area. The first thing I'll say is if you have a mature citrus tree, this is a cosmetic pest. It will not kill your tree. It's a little moth. The little caterpillar mines within the leaf, and it causes distortion. It will not affect your fruit yield, so don't worry about it unless it's a young tree. And young, I'm talking 3 years or less that you're still trying to train and grow. In that case, You can use pheromone traps to monitor for the adults. If the adults are present, you could avoid fertilization at that time. The reason is because the larvae require this new flush in order to get into the leaves and start moving around. Avoid broad spectrum insecticides. And there are some contact insecticides, spinosad and azadirachtin. That's a component of neem oil. And those can be used when the adults are laying eggs. How do you know they're laying eggs? You have to trap them using pheromone traps. So this is a more involved IPM program, but it is doable if you're trying to protect young citrus trees. Beetles, they get into our stressed, especially drought stressed trees, and there are a lot of neonicotinoids that are labeled for these kinds of beetles. I will say that boring beetles are symptoms. They are not primary problems. If you have beetles boring into your trees, it's because your trees are not happy. So you have to provide proper irrigation and maintenance to prevent stress in the trees. You can monitor for adult beetle flights. There are traps made for that. If you have extremely valuable trees, and I don't know what that means, but if you would know, if you have an extremely valuable trees, you can protect them with barrier insecticides that prevent the adults from boring in and laying eggs. And those do not include neonicotinoids. Psyllids, we have a lot of different psyllids on things like eugenia, I think lots of eucalyptus, boxwood. There's a number of different psyllids. And then, of course, the scary one, the Asian citrus psyllid. These guys cause cosmetic damage and distorted growth, but some of them vector disease, including the citrus psyllid. So you can try to avoid them by not planting susceptible species. These are host-specific animals. You can try to avoid fertilization because, again, they need this new flush of plant growth to thrive. You can prune out the infestation, just like with the soft scale. You can conserve natural enemies, and we've been talking about this already. And you can consider these contact insecticides, especially spinosad, which does have some translocation to get into some of these protected galls where the psyllids might be feeding. And then finally, white grubs and turf. Major issue in the Bay Area. You don't usually notice it until late fall, Halloween. And it's because raccoons and skunks and turkeys and geese and crows and wild pigs, they start digging up the grass. They cause damage like this overnight. If it's a high value turf area, this is a nightmare. The reason is they're after these beetle larvae, these scarab grubs. Usually the masked chafer beetle is the species. And the beetles may not cause that much damage, but they're very attractive to these vertebrates, like our friend the raccoon, as a food source. So how do we avoid this problem? It really comes down to proper turf selection and maintenance. So that's proper irrigation, mowing height, and frequency. And then if you really are worried about grubs, you need to be monitoring right now. If you wait until Mr. Raccoon is digging things up, you've missed the boat. And that's because these guys have a univoltine life cycle. They only have one generation per year. So if you don't kill them before they're fat and juicy, you will not prevent the raccoon from digging them up. So that requires monitoring. Hey, that's IPM, isn't it? Maybe you can exclude vertebrates if it's possible, if you can fence an area effectively. And then if you do have grubs and you do some monitoring in summer, right now will be a great time. Nematodes work great. And then there's a new BT product called Grub Gun that works reasonably well. Or you could convert to a succulent landscape like I did, and you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so all of you listening, what can you do to help? Conceivably, you guys are growing plants, you're the backyard gardeners. I really hope you understand how to read your pesticide labels. You may say, hey, I never apply pesticides. Sometimes you may break that rule if you have a major pest issue. Know how to read the label, know what active ingredient is in your product. If it's a systemic insecticide, you need to worry about all of these things we just reviewed. Read the label and follow the guidelines. Don't apply more than the label says because you think it will work better. Don't dispose of the product down the drain or some other illegal method. And you know, this is here because I've used this slide for other audiences like professionals. Limit applications to situations where they are required. What's required? I don't know. It's debatable. If you're talking about a hobbyist garden or an ornamental landscape, you could argue that these materials are never required. If they are, and you make that case, that's up to you. Please delay the applications until after the plant has flowered. Consider one of the active ingredients that doesn't stick around for years, you know, and take precautions to avoid drift and runoff of that application. I represent UCIPM. We've got lots of information there. I hope you guys are familiar with the website. One thing that you may not know about is our pesticide active ingredients database. So you can find information about whatever active ingredient is on your pesticide product. If you want to know, you know, how toxic is this to bees or to fish or to birds or to humans, we aggregate that information. Here's the page for imidacloprid, very high toxicity to honeybees, moderately high to natural enemies, medium acute toxicity to people and other mammals. You know, this says low in water quality. I think this is outdated. Based on what we're finding, I think this needs to be read here for water quality. But anyway, this information is out there. Please check it out. We also have our pest notes. This is the one for the citrus leaf miner. It walks you through the whole IPM program and talks about some of the issues associated with some of the insecticides labeled for the pest. We have a YouTube channel. Everybody loves YouTube. We have a series of short videos. I think we're approaching 100 videos now that teach about all kinds of things. One of our more popular ones is called What's in That Pesticide? It's a little animated feature that teaches you how to read a pesticide label. A new product that came out that I helped author is this vegetable pest ID cards. You know, gardens and small farms, these ID cards. We cover all the common pests of the vegetables and small farms, and we talk about alternatives to insecticides prominently. So that's all I've got for you guys. I think I'm on time, and I'm here for your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and let's get started with questions.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This was really interesting. So I believe I'm allowing Birgit to talk now. And we have questions.
We do have questions. Are you hearing me?
Yep.
Here.
All right. So we've got a lot of questions. Probably the biggest and sort of broadest category question: are most nursery plants sprayed with this kind of chemicals, i.e. systemic insecticides?
Yeah, that's an unknown. I mean, that study that I highlighted, Gardeners Beware, they tried to answer that question by sampling from different nurseries, and they did find systemic insecticides. They saw that number decreasing over time. But yes, depending on who is growing those plants, I'll tell you, I used to be in the nursery industry, and it's really easy to apply systemic insecticides. You have protected that plant for the whole season. It's a lot easier than scouting for a pest, looking for natural enemies, using a contact insecticide, doing selective pruning. And we all know that nurseries are on very tight profit margins. They have labor issues. So I think it's naive to think that nurseries are not using these materials.
Thank you. This is my question. You talked about a number of different ways to treat the various problems, aphids, thrips, psyllid, etc. And you talked about spraying water or using insecticidal soaps. And I would just like your comment on the effect that those interventions might have on natural enemies and on the entire insect ecosystem.
Yeah, great questions. Pesticides are designed to kill things. It doesn't matter if it's one of these systemics or if it's an organic essential oil or something like that. So there's going to be non-targets. There's going to be fallout associated with the application. Even a water spray, you're going to kill other things. So anytime you manage pests, you're trying to find a balance between the risk associated with the pest and the risk associated with the pest management. And you want to minimize the risk associated with the pest management. And you want to ask the question, what's the risk of doing nothing? What if I do nothing? Are my roses going to have aphids? Maybe they will. You know, are the new shoots on my citrus tree going to be a little distorted? Maybe they will. And if you can live with that damage, then perhaps you don't need to do anything. But yes, organic pesticides kill non-target organisms. Oils and soaps are very toxic to whatever you spray, whether it's aphids or you know, ladybird larva, you're going to kill it.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions and they're sort of related. And one person had heard that Alameda still uses insecticides while Oakland and Berkeley have stopped. And they were curious as to whether that was true and what Alameda parks are using. And then there was a follow-up on how have East Bay cities encouraged commercial landlords not to use neonicotinoids. I don't know if you can address either one of those, but I thought I would ask.
Yeah, so I don't know of any cities that have straight up stopped using pesticides. They all report their use to the state, and the data is available publicly, so you can actually check. Now, of course, the data is not in real time. It's from last year. They only upload the data annually, but you can look, and the city of Alameda, the city of Oakland, city of Berkeley, they are all registered users, and they have to report their use. So you can track that, and you can see what's been applied where. There's also posting requirements if you're in a public area like a park. So I think it's pretty likely that some cities, like I think Berkeley has done this, in public areas, they have really shied away from pesticide applications because of the public response, but they're still probably using pesticides to protect their structures, their highly valued landscapes. Yeah, so I think it's not true that any of these cities have stopped pesticide use altogether. And then the question about the commercial landlords, I don't know anything about that. It would be totally voluntary. And so you're basically asking some private landowner to stop managing their private land the way that they want to do it. Maybe if they understood the ecological ramifications, they'd be more likely, but all of this is voluntary. There are no restrictions other than the pesticide label itself on you know, who uses and how they use the materials.
Right. Okay, couple about pets. The first one was, what do you think of Spinatorum used in Cheristan?
Yeah, I personally don't have experience with that one, but it's related to spinosad, which is derived from a bacterium. So it has, you know, what you can call a natural source, whatever that means. I mean, to me, everything's natural. It didn't come from another dimension, right? So if you made it in a lab with your hands, it's still natural to me. But if it comes from a bacterium, some people are more likely to see that as reduced risk. I don't know about that particular active ingredient. Spinosad, which is related to it, does have some systemic activity. Think about it. It wouldn't work on your pet unless it was systemic. If you apply it to the pet and you expect it to go throughout that pet's body, it has to be systemic. So if you like, you can email me and I'll follow up on that, but I'm not familiar with that product. I haven't used it. I have dogs and cats, but I haven't used it.
All right, and the next one related was, you mentioned that frontline type flea and tick, where the oil is applied to the skin of the animal, get in the water if you wash your dog. Is Bravecto better since it's in pill form?
All of these are systemic insecticides. So they're the ones that are in an oily formulation are more likely to get washed off. The ones that are orally applied are inside the animal, and they can come out in the feces. They could be in the hair itself that comes out when you wash your animal. But I think it is a way to reduce that exposure. And so I use oral formulations for my animals because of that.
Thank you. Next question. Does OMRI certification, that's the organic certification, take systemic toxicity or durability of pesticides in the earth into account? Are there any other certifications we can look for?
As far as I know, none of these systemic insecticides we discussed are OMRI certified. There's also the USDA's organic programs, more for agriculture, and I think the EPA has one as well. It says for organic gardening. None of these neonicotinoids or fipronil are approved by those organic certifiers.
Thank you. What is your opinion of spraying BT in the vegetable garden? Is it really safe?
Yeah, so BT is a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, and the bacteria actually produce a toxic crystal, which when consumed by insects destroys their digestive system and they starve. It only affects certain kinds of insects. Most of the BT products only affect caterpillars. There are some other ones that affect fly larvae, like fungus gnats and mosquito larvae. And the product that I was talking about, Grub Gone, actually targets beetle larvae. And so in theory, these products only affect insects and even kind of specific taxa within insects. So I do consider them to be reduced risk for the environment and for people. With BT products, they must be applied when the target insect is still young and growing. That's because it has to consume the product. Just spraying is not going to kill the insect. The caterpillar has to eat a leaf that has the residue of the BT. And so if the caterpillars are already full size, or the grubs in your lawn are already full size, they're not eating anymore and it won't be effective. But yes, it is considered reduced risk. There's a number of organic BT products. I encourage you to play around with BT. It can be very effective.
Thank you. Someone asked for ideas for fighting thrips.
Biting thrips. Yeah.
Fighting thrips.
Oh, fighting thrips. Okay. I thought
Sorry,
you said
just an ordinary question.
Yeah, well, thrips do bite. You know, my wife is sensitive to them. They fly around and they have sharp little mouth parts, but I don't know what to do about that. They don't mean to bite us. They're just being defensive. Thrips are tough because if it's the type of thrips, like a flower thrips, they're going to be inside tight crevices in a plant. So the contact insecticides don't work as well. But greenhouse thrips, which are the ones which attack like rhododendron, beans, lots of garden plants. They feed usually on the underside of the leaf, and they're exposed. So they can be killed with contact insecticides, the oils and soaps, and even water sprays that we're using against aphids can be very, very effective. So I think you're monitoring for thrips damage, you look to see the thrips are present, and you can make a contact insecticide application or a water spray. With flower thrips or thrips that gall, I think if you prune and dispose of those infested parts, that may be the best you can do without using systemic insecticides.
Thank you. And another one, ideas for fighting ants.
Baits, 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 baits. You have to use sometimes a large volume of bait. Whatever you do, don't put bait stations inside your house. Sometimes you have an infestation of ants in your kitchen and you think, okay, I'm going to put baits in the kitchen, but what you're doing is you're drawing more ants inside. Most of the time, we're talking about Argentine ants. They live outside. So you usually can go out to the outside of the house and figure out where the nest is, or at least where there's a lot of ants. And you can use a bait station, which is tamper-proof. They have these liquid reservoirs. Some of them look like big UFOs or water towers. Some of them are cylinders that you apply or you sink into the ground. And liquid bait works very well. If you have to, you can use the bait stations inside. But if you're dealing with an outside insect like Argentine ants, it's going to take a long time. So it may take months of baiting before you knock out that population. If you can't handle it, you can get a professional pest control service, and they usually will knock out your ants in one visit, maybe 2 visits. But guess what? They use fipronil, which is a systemic insecticide, and it is highly regulated by the state. So I would say to learn about baits, liquid formulations, gel formulations, they all work well if you can get the ants to eat them and you can apply enough.
Thank you, Andrew. I think that's my problem is I keep baiting inside my kitchen and then
Go outside and find the nest, and then buy one of those big bait stations. There's one called Ant Cafe, and there's one called Antopia. Yeah, and you'll do it. It's going to take probably all summer, but you'll get them under control.
Will do. Another question. I have a recurring grassy weed in my driveway. I have tried my blowtorch multiple times and an organic and herbicide called Burnout, but nothing works. What else can I do?
I'm not a weed scientist. I don't use any herbicides at my house. I just use good old-fashioned elbow grease. Sometimes you got to keep pulling. In my experience, if you pull the weed enough times, you're denying the below ground portions photosynthesis. So they're not able to, grow as well. And it may take years of you trying to pull that plant. Eventually it may die. I don't know what to tell you. The blowtorch is a step way above what I've done.
Thank you. Yeah, I've had the same problem. It's difficult. One more. I think we've got one more question. Since the indiscriminate application or misapplication of pesticides in urban environments is so prevalent by untrained homeowners, why are they not removed from the marketplace or restricted to very small amounts per year per household? And then in parentheses, it says small quantities at a high price might slow the use of pesticides in general.
Go into your wallet and open it up and get some of that green stuff out. Money, that's why. So those consumer product manufacturers are very powerful lobbyists. There's a lot of money. We're talking billions and billions in consumer pest control products. So as long as that's the case, they're going to resist regulation. It needs to happen at the federal level because that's who registers pesticides for home use. The problem is it's really not moving forward. If companies make money, then they're going to produce that product. If a product is effective, then the homeowner is going to buy that. And so until federal and state governments decide, you know, it's important to regulate those and they become more powerful than the consumer product lobbies, it's not going to move. Then you have the internet sales problem. The internet is the Wild West. You can buy all kinds of products online. All I can say is, you know, try to educate your community, and, you know, educate people at the store when you're there and they're looking at pesticides. You know, little by little, I'm optimistic we can make a difference, but there's a lot of money in those products and they're not going away. Think about the on-pet products. You know, they work very well. There are billions and billions of dollars at stake. It's not going to be easy to remove any of those things from the market.
Thank you, Andrew. I think I would add one thought to that, and that is maybe that if we vote with our pocketbooks and we start asking at nurseries about whether or not there are systemic insecticides, that might help to prompt a little bit less use.
Yeah, maybe so. And you saw in the study that I highlighted that the nurseries in their case study did have fewer and fewer detections over time. So maybe they were responding to their customers.
Right. I think we have actually seen that with a number of companies recently when people have really when they've started getting letters from people that they have actually been responsive, which is what we would hope for. So perhaps that's the way to go.
I see a late question that came in, and it's related to the work that I do. Door-to-door pesticide sales people, do they give you a list of the chemicals they use? I think you're talking about pest control services, and they absolutely do. They have to, especially when asked, educate you about what they're going to apply and why. And then after application, they do give you a report on the product and the active ingredient, and you can look up all kinds of information afterwards if you are so inclined. Most people just recycle that and go back to dinner.
Great.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate your time and all of the wonderful information that you have shared with us.
Yes, we appreciate all of you who came and listened and asked questions. We hope that you'll attend another Alameda Backyard Growers event. So thanks very much. Goodbye. Good night for now.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.